Hi, this is Anai, and in today's video I'm going to be talking about how to best divide your practice session into sections that are going to get you the best results. I often get asked how long I spend on technique, how much time I spend practicing repertoire or repeating old pieces, how much time I spend on new pieces, how much time I spend on sight reading. So today I'm going to try to compile all my experiences and tell you what has helped me the most. I'm also going to speak about some famous pianists' practice habits that I've read about in books about them or that I've seen in documentaries about them, because I thought that might also be interesting. Before I get into the video, I just wanted to tell you that my next video is going to be a Q&A. So if you have any specific questions that you want to ask me and that I should answer, you can just leave them in the comments down below, and I'm going to try to include them in the next video. So before I start talking about actual time of how long to spend on each section, I think it's very important to mention that practice should be connected to progress. I think it's very important that when you're practicing, you don't feel that there is any stagnation or that you're not really improving or even maybe going backwards a little bit. And this can happen if you are practicing too much repertoire, for example. So I think it's important that when you plan out your practice session, you really check in with yourself according to your skill level and according to how much time you have throughout the day to see what is realistic for you to manage. So, for example, if you are someone that practices 2 hours a day, I would not recommend trying to learn 20 pieces at the same time, because this is just not going to work out. Try to rather focus on a couple of pieces, get them on a really high level pretty quickly, then focus on the other pieces. Also, if you're practicing one very hard piece that obviously is a long-term goal, for example, make sure that you also have some easier pieces that are short-term goals and that are going to give you this feeling of satisfaction, even if this long-term piece is taking quite a while and you won't be really feeling the progress unless a couple of months have passed. You get this satisfaction and the feeling of progress from the easier pieces. So make sure that at the end of the day, you can always look back on your practice session and really confidently say, this and this and this got better, and feel good about yourself. Because ending a practice day with the feeling of, well, nothing really happened and let's hope that in a year I'm going to be a better pianist, of course, won't help you, because you need to be happy in order to make progress when practicing. So now, before I talk more about my tips and what I look out for when planning my practice session, I wanted to mention a couple of very famous musicians and pianists especially, and what they have said about practice. So the first person that I read about concerning his practicing was Paderewski, and he claimed that he practiced all day long. Whatever that means, I don't know, but it seems that he basically spent his entire day at the piano. A very opposite example is Glenn Gould. He has said in many documentaries and in his books that he actually practiced very little, and that his main practice was mental practice. So very little at the piano and a lot of mental practice. I think mental practice in general is a whole chapter in itself that is very interesting and can be very, very rewarding, but it's also something that you have to train and that you have to get better at, because it's not as easy as it sounds to just think about the piece. So for him, apparently it worked really well, and I also believe that if you do a lot of mental practice, you can really do a lot less practice at the piano and you're going to get the same results. Another interesting thing that I read was by Backhaus, and I think this is particularly interesting to this video because it's not just the amount of hours that he practiced, but it's also how he divided it up. And he said no matter how many hours he spent practicing a day, he always devoted one entire hour just to technique. So technical exercises, scales, arpeggios, he did for 1 hour each day, no matter what else he did. Even if he just did 1 hour, then he did only technique. Now we're getting to another interesting example, which is Arau, and I've read very many different things about him. One thing that I read at one instance is a little bit crazy. It said that especially when he was younger, he would practice up to 18 hours a day. This is something that I really cannot even imagine. It seems completely unrealistic to me, but I guess that of course you can spend 18 hours a day at the piano. I would definitely say it is not a sustainable thing to do for a long period of time. And also I read in some other texts about him that on average he practiced 2 to 3 hours a day. So that I think sounds much more realistic. Another thing that is very interesting about him is that he said he took a month off practicing every year. So no matter how much he practiced during the 11 months that he was practicing, he always consciously planned 1 month of no practice for each year, which I think is a very interesting habit, especially considering that he was an active professional pianist. A rather funny example to me is Richter, because there is a video where he says that he only practices very little and only a few hours a day, and then he's immediately dismissed by his wife, who says, oh, he spends up to 10 hours a day at the piano. So I guess we can already tell that when pianists talk about their practice, of course, it's not always 100% accurate. And of course, it's also clear that it's not the same. You have days where you practice a lot and days where you practice just a little bit, but that's what he said. Another big supporter of mental practice was King. He also wrote books about mental practice. He's a big proponent of mental practice in general. And he also said he practiced at the piano very, very little and mainly did mental practice. Then we have a series of pretty famous pianists, Ashkenazi, Brendel, Pogorelic, and they've all said that in their prime they practiced around 5 hours a day. Oh, and another rather funny example I thought was Prokofiev. He said he doesn't need too much practice because his fingers never forget. So this was just a little excursion into some of the most famous pianists, just to see what they are doing. I always think it's interesting to get inspired by those who are obviously amazing at their craft. But now I'm going to talk a little bit about what I focus on when planning my practice session. So as I already said, I think making sure that you have progress is very, very important. And also something that I have mentioned in some of my previous videos is the 80-20 rule, which is that you usually get 80% of the result with only 20% of the work that you put into. So you can get most of the result with a little amount of work. How I have applied this to my practice is that I really try to focus on the things that I actually still cannot play. So let's say that I have a piece, I try to focus on the spots that really don't work yet, instead of always repeating the spots that I already can play quite well. And once I get the spots that I can't play yet and I have everything on a kind of similar level, then I focus on the entire piece again. I think that is really a very helpful tip, and many friends of mine that are professional musicians have also talked about this, that is so important to focus on the difficult bits, on the hard bits that are not quite in your fingers and in your mind yet, because then there's always going to be this difference. Easy bit, hard bit, rather than them kind of aligning and getting on one level. I would recommend, if you are someone who is studying the piano or who is looking towards a professional career and is therefore devoting a substantial amount of your time towards practicing, I would suggest to find an average of about 4 hours a day and to divide those 4 hours up into technical warm-up exercises, studies, repertoire pieces, and sight reading. And the way I do it is I warm up for about 30 minutes, and that includes everything: scales, arpeggios, chords, chromatic scales, everything, stretching exercises, so that I feel really comfortable. Then I would devote another 30 minutes to studies, whichever studies you are doing or repeating at the moment: Chopin studies, Liszt studies, Czerny studies, Brahms, so that you have 1 hour of, let's say, kind of technical exercises, studies, and just simple exercises. And then I would go into the repertoire for about 2.5 hours, and then do the last 30 minutes by practicing sight reading. Now, this is a very flexible schedule. Of course, you can totally change it up, and I change it up all the time. Sometimes I only do 30 minutes of warm-up and studies and then do 3 hours of repertoire. Sometimes I leave out the sight reading altogether and do 3.5 hours of repertoire, just because this is, of course, what is going to be taking the upper hand more and more as you perform, and or if you have an exam, the more pieces you have to learn, the more you will want to focus on repertoire. But when practicing the repertoire, I think it's important, as I mentioned before, to have realistic goals. So let's say that you are practicing 3 new pieces and are trying to maybe repeat 2 old ones. You can do a kind of rotation thing where you practice 2 new pieces and 1 old one on one day, then on the next day the other old one and the new piece that you didn't do on the first day and repeat one of the other ones. If you have 3 practice days, you practice each of the new pieces on 2 of them. So kind of rotate. And also, I think if you are rotating and you have a break, so one day where you don't practice a specific piece, that also really helps because it kind of gets into your subconscious, it sets into your muscles, into your muscle memory, into your mind, and then when you pick it up again on the other day, it's going to feel much more secure. Also, when dividing the repertoire hours into repeat pieces and new pieces, of course I would devote the substantial amount of time to the new pieces. That's what needs so much more work, and repeating of course is also very important and needs work, but not nearly as much as learning new pieces. So generally I would say the first part is definitely technique, warm-up and studies, then maybe 70-75% should be repertoire, and then a little amount at the end, 5 to 10% of sight reading. I really hope that you found this video helpful about how to plan your practice session. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you again in the next video. Bye!